on early fractions. We're going to get started, but if you haven't had a chance to introduce yourself in the chat, just let us know what province or school board you're from and what grade you might teach. So taking a look at some of these images, what strategies for equal partitioning do you see? Thinking about the students in your class or the kids that you might interact with, what sorts of strategies do you see these two using to separate that birthday cake? Did you see folding? Maybe you saw measuring or counting. Did you see cutting or visualizing? Or maybe even they might be dividing those cupcakes up. So these examples all come from one of our grade 2 stories, The Best Birthday, where we've got twins celebrating their birthday and they're trying to figure out how to divide their birthday cake. This big idea, quantities and numbers can be grouped by or partitioned into equal units, comes from the Pearson math learning progression. And this was developed in Canada at the University of Alberta with Dr. Lynn McGarvey. And she did lots of research thinking about lots of learning progressions and how kids develop in their understanding of fractions. So this very last thread, thinking about partitioning quantities to form fractions, shows how some students might develop in their understanding of early fractions, where K is at the far left and grade 3 being at the very far right. And so today we're going to use some of the Mathologie resources to sort of unpack these ideas of how students develop in their understanding of fractions as we go through some of the stories and some of the activities we have available in Mathologie. So do you ever see students do this? Which piece would you want? So we often see students or even young children thinking about when they're dividing a piece, they might know that it's not right, but they're not exactly sure how. So the very beginning of our learning progression begins with visually comparing. So they might just look at the two pieces and decide that they're not even or not fair, but not know exactly how to determine how to make it fair. So they might be naming that fractional amount very informally. I have half, you have half, and thinking about how to equally share that piece of cake. So again, like we mentioned before, we're going to be talking about some of the materials that are offered in Mathologie, and we'll be thinking about them along the way. So this image allows students to start thinking about some of the ways in which we talk about fractions. What about equally sharing? When you think about these two students on the left, or these three students on the right, how might they share the items equally? How might you see young children share these items? When we see students sharing with friends and making equal shares, they're really focusing on what's fair. And so how do they do that? Have you ever seen a student go one at a time using a counter or a concrete material to sort of keep track of who gets what? One for you, one for me, one for you, one for me, and continuing along the way with those concrete materials. Other students might number them off or circle them in order to make sure that they share those equally. And this activity card comes from one of our grade 2 activity kits, where students have an opportunity to model and solve those equal sharing problems and start thinking about fractions, dividing pieces equally. Now, we know that there are times when students might need a little bit of differentiation to partition and make those equal sized parts into a fair share or an equal group. And so Mathologie allows you to flip the card over and differentiate. You might provide concrete materials, you might act it out, or you might even use the other side of the card, as you see here in the bottom corner, to help meet the students where they are in their understanding about equal sharing. And so throughout the webinar, we're going to be posting up pieces of that learning progression to see how it unfolds as we go along. So I'm going to give you about 30 seconds to think about this and think about materials that we give to students when they're starting to explore equal parts. What kinds of materials do you provide for your students? And how might these materials help you explore equal parts? I'm going to give you about 30 seconds to think about that, and we'll come right back. So can you imagine students maybe pulling the string nice and long and folding it by holding end to end in half? Or maybe they take some scissors and they cut up the ribbon, or they roll out the plasticine into little pieces, or maybe they fold like they did that little bottom piece of blue paper. So getting students to explore equal parts in a lot of different ways really helps to develop that understanding of fractions. What fractional names might your students already know? We know that when they enter some of our classrooms, they already have some of this vocabulary with them. Do they use words like half or third or even fourth? Can they split that piece of paper into 4 parts? First in half, then in half again? Can they name each of those parts as we see each part being worth 1/4? Part of using different materials is allowing kids to think about equal parts in lots of different ways. And paper is just one of those ways, but you might have them think about cutting or folding or overlaying or even splitting up that plasticine to think about those equal parts in different ways. So the next piece of our learning progression is when students partition or split those holes into equal intervals or into equal sets, and they're able to name the unit of those fractions. So we've moved from informal naming into naming the fraction using a little more formal language. So This, these materials come from one of our grade 1 activities, and this is an example of one of our teacher cards. And on the left side, you see the teacher instructions, things like the before and the what to do, and some consolidation. And on the very back, you're going to see some of the um, visual cues or some of the suggestions for what you might see or hear and some next steps. So thinking about these features, what do you see that might support you as a teacher in your own practice? I'm going to give you a few minutes to think about that, and we'll come right back. All right, so thinking about some of these cards, some of the things that we've heard from teachers is these probing questions across the bottom. Something like, how did you decide to fold or cut your item to make equal parts? So when you think about that paper on the previous side, or the yarn, or the plasticine, how might your students have decided to fold that up or cut it and make equal parts with the materials that they have? When they choose to share an item, does every person get an equal amount? Or are they thinking about it in a different way and they're not thinking about giving each person an equal part? When you look at the back of the card on the right-hand side, these are some of the looks fors that you might be using when you're walking around the class and thinking about the way that your students are dividing those materials that you've provided them. Here we see paper being shared, or pattern blocks, or other examples of materials that they might partition, thinking about the whole being split into lots of different parts. So for each one of our activities, we've got a teacher card that helps you really narrow in on what you might be looking for from students and what kinds of opportunities you might set up for them to think about equal parts. So one of the things that we have explored a little bit further is paper folding. So how does this activity of paper folding help students compare fractions? So I'm going to give you just a minute to think about that, and you can put some of your ideas in the chat if you'd like. So for some of our learners, getting their hands on that paper and really physically folding it gets them to think about comparing. So you notice here, each one of our holes is the same size, but they've divided it or split it into equal parts. The first one being 2 equal parts, the second being 4 equal parts, and of course the last being 8 equal parts. So getting students to experiment in lots of different ways to think about how fractions might present themselves when the whole is the same really helps develop some of their understanding about fractions. When they relate the size of the parts, do they see that the more times they share, the smaller each one of those parts become? So when I split a whole into half, or 2 equal parts, they're a lot bigger than when I split the same whole into 8 equal parts. And so that's one of the big ideas that kids need to really wrap their heads around when they're thinking about fractions. So I'm going to give you a minute to type into the chat pod, thinking about the student on the left-hand side. They've been asked to explore equal parts, thinking about the green rod being the whole. What does this student know? And what does it reveal about their student thinking? You'll notice on the right-hand side, I've given you some of the things that you might see or hear about this student. What box would you say that this student is demonstrating? I'm going to give you about 30 seconds to put your answer into the chat, and we'll be right back. Here we notice that this student's able to take that whole green rod, and separate it into 2 equal parts, again into 3 equal parts, and again into 6 equal parts. But when they've gone and transitioned into the drawing, we see that they may have made a little error on the very last row. Now, in the concrete materials, they've demonstrated that thinking, and when they've transferred it into a pictorial representation, they've may have made a mistake, whether it's intentional or not. So we may want to draw some attention to that. We may ask a question to see if they may notice that error of splitting the last third into only 1/6 rather than into 2/6. But here we see that a student's able to name those parts and divide into halves and into thirds and into 6 concretely. And then that transfer into pictorial is where they have a little bit of, they may need a little bit of support. So here on the back of the card, you can see that a student may not notice where the error is, or they may not be able to even compare some of those parts. So some of our next steps here will help you support a student moving from one box to the next. Using concrete materials like we've talked about, and transitioning into pictorial and symbolic representations like using the names is another way that students develop in their understanding of fractions. Comparing fractions to the relative size, knowing that half is smaller than a whole, or a third is smaller than a half, or 2/6 are the same as 1/3 of the exact same whole, are really important in getting students to really create a more in-depth understanding of fractions. So we're going to go into Mathology.ca and take a look at some of the supports we have for students in developing their understanding of fractions. So Mathology.ca is a platform that allows teachers to search, plan, teach, assess and track, and offers professional learning along the way. Let's go in there. Here, you can see that when I'm looking at working on equal parts, I can do a search for equal parts. And I can see that there's a grade 2 activity available for me to work on equal parts and explore equal parts as well. I may be more interested though in searching by curriculum, which is another way to think about using this platform. When I search by curriculum, I can go with my overall. If I'm looking at grade 1, I can look at my overall expectations and use the magnifying glass to do a search. In this case, divide whole objects into parts and identify and describe through investigation equal-sized parts of the whole using fractional names. When I do a search, here I see that grade 1 lesson that we've talked about earlier becomes available for us. Another way that I can narrow down the search is either by grade, by type, this case being an activity, or by strand. In this case, I might narrow it down to just number. When I'm back on the home screen, you can see that some of the activities I've pinned to my home screen, and I'm able to do this with lessons along the way, so that when I want to quickly access the lesson that we were just talking about, I can have it on my front page that I can easily access. Here, when we see the lesson, I'm able to navigate using the About, Details, Assessment, and related resources. In the About section, I'm able to quickly see what this lesson's all about. It also provides me with an overview of the curriculum that's being met by using this activity, as well as the learning progression that we're unpacking here today. We know that this lesson is going to help me compare unit fractions to determine a relative size. Once I've determined that this is a lesson for me or my class to help develop a little more in-depth understanding of comparing fractions, I go into the details. Here you'll see the activity card set up where all the line masters are available in PDF or Word. The instructions are here for me in a 3-part lesson framework with before, what to do, and consolidation supports. As I scroll down, I always see the ability to differentiate for my class with accommodations, extensions, and combined grade extensions. We also have probing questions that help you uncover student thinking a little bit more in depth. We also have the interactive tools. I'm just going to click on one to give you a sense of what they do. So when I pull out a relational rod like that student did, they pulled out the green rod, and I can eliminate the numbers. We might talk about the green rod being my whole. And so we saw that student pull out 2 green rods to divide it into 2 equal parts or halves. We also saw them use the red part to divide into 3 equal parts. And we may pause here and ask them to rethink how many white rods might we need to cover the same space as the green whole. This is one way to think about comparing fractions using relational rods. When I go back into the lesson, I see my assessment tab, and the assessment allows me to input all my students into the class. I can enter them in any way that I'd like, and I can easily click, drag, and drop when I see Sadia taking the rod but struggling to partition it into equal parts. So if Sadia takes out those purple rods and is using it to divide the green rod in half, we may be asking a few next steps for her. We may ask her to cover the rod exactly. There can't be any gaps or overlaps. So we may have her go back and rethink what rods she could use. She might test another rod to check it out. So the next steps are always there for each one of those pieces. You also may see Kyle and Hannah do the same thing at the same time. You can highlight them and drop them into each one of those boxes as well. And you're also able to make notes along the way. Maybe there's something specific that you want to highlight for Kyle that you noticed he was displaying or showing as you walked around the classroom. Yeah, it does look like the back of the card. Thanks for pointing that out. It's an exact mirror of the back of the card. So when we look at the back of the card that's available on the details page, and I pull it up, these 6 boxes are duplicated in that assessment tab, all printable for you here on Mathology.ca. Once I'm done this lesson, we know that some students might need a little bit more. There might be some students that need a mini lesson that continues them along the path that they're on, thinking about on-grade mini lessons where they continue to practice that skill. But other students may need an intervention or an extension, and all of these are available to print. There's also some misconceptions that you might pay attention to as you're walking around the class. Think about in advance and keep an eye out for when students are comparing fractions. We also have next steps in class and at home to support the learning outside the classroom. Here you'll see word wall words, key vocabulary that you might want to make sure that you're addressing as you work through some of these activities, as well as the lessons that either precede or follow this particular lesson. Here we have another option to think about comparing fractions in a different way, as well as exploring equal parts. Once you've gone through and you've decided that this is the lesson for you, you may have read some of the details and want a little bit more information. On the right-hand side, you see a tab that provides you with the learning highlight video. There are learning highlight videos for every single activity, and I'll give you a sample of what that might look like. They're all short 1-minute videos to give you a little bit more information about what you might be looking for when you're working with your students.
Encourage students to explore the different colored rods and the relationships among them. Do they realize that the first rod they pick represents the whole? In this case, the orange rod. Do they see that some rods can be covered in many different ways, while others in only one way? Help students see that the length of the part for the same unit fraction depends on the length of the whole. For instance, 1/4 of the pink rod is a white rod, but 1/4 of the brown rod is a red rod. How do the two 1/4 rods compare? To consolidate, talk about how the same rod can represent different unit fractions, depending on the hole. For example, the red rod represents 1/2 of the pink rod, but 1/3 of the dark green rod. At the same time, the red rod
I'm stuck. Give me just a moment.
can represent the
All right, so I'll leave it for now, but you get the idea of each one of these videos being approximately 1 minute in length to help you think about what sorts of relationships that kids might be thinking about, or what sorts of things you might be looking for as they explore using relational rods. Another type of video we have is a learning connection video that ties in all the books and the activities that you've seen here today. It's going to help us better understand that one big idea about quantities being partitioned into many ways, and of course with the focus on fractions. Here I'll give you a little sneak peek.
How many dinosaurs are there? How might you group them to count? In this video, we'll explore the learning pathway for the big idea quantities and numbers can be grouped by or partitioned into equal-sized units, outlined in Pearson's learning progression. Several Mathologie resources, such as this Grade 2 activity, support students in unitizing, comparing, and partitioning quantities to form fractions. One important concept that students
So I'm going to pull through to the third thread that we're focusing on today.
is partitioning quantities to form fractions. Students use strategies to partition a whole into equal-sized parts and name the parts to share. In this Grade 2 Little Book, students use a variety of strategies, such as folding or measuring using non-standard units, such as toothpicks, to visually compare fraction sizes and then name the fractional amounts. As students become familiar with partitioning different sets, they learn to count by unit fractions. In this Grade 3 Little Book, students might look at this.
All right, so I'll leave it there. You get the idea. So each one of these are about 5 minutes, and they really unpack that learning progression a little bit more. These videos are available for each and every lesson, and they'll be sitting here in this sidebar. One other thing I'd like to show you is the analytics. So as you gather information about some of your students and the understanding that they have about fractions, you can narrow down how your class is doing as well as your students, your individual students. So here, for example, we have the curriculum view. We can narrow down the grade and the strand that we're working on, as well as seeing the overall expectation and the activities that we've done to address that expectation. When you drop down the arrow, you can see the status of your class for each one of those activities, how many students you've assessed, and where they are sitting on the back of the card. You can see at a quick glance what your students might need to be paying a little bit more attention to, as well as in the student view. So if I go into a student view, I can select a particular student and narrow in on how they're doing when I think about number sense. You have to bear with my computer as it loads up. So I'll come back to that in just a minute, but here you'd have the opportunity to see Cassius and how he's doing on each one of the activities, as well as the assessments that you've done for him. Another piece of support that we have is the planning component. In here, we have pre-created plans that will help support you along the way. So we've got in here a grade 2 sample long-range plan that I might go into and select to use as a sample. Here, if we're working on early fractions, I can scroll down to later on in the year and think about early fraction. And here are the activities that I have in a sequence that I can alter or follow if that works best for you. Let's go back to the presentation. So what's in Mathology.ca? Right now, I've shown you some of the activities. For grade 1 and grade 2, you've got over 101 and 185 math lessons that come from our activity kit that you've seen here today. We also have a variety of Mathologie little books that are available for grade 1 and grade 2, as well as the links to the learning progression that you saw here today. We mentioned the professional learning videos that are also available, and grade 3 is coming in the fall. Any questions so far before I keep going? So keep in mind here that as we correlate everything to the learning progression, of course we correlate everything to the curriculum as well. So all that you see in Mathology.ca will be linked directly to your individual curriculum. Here you've seen today that I've focused on the Ontario curriculum, but of course it would be correlated to your own individual province. And if any changes are made, it will of course be adapted as soon as possible. So let's take a look at this example. This is an image that comes from our grade 3 story hockey homework. And sometimes you might use an image to evoke lots of different types of fractional models. So what type of fractional models do you see in this image? And how might you partition them? I'm going to give you about 30 seconds to think about that, and we'll be right back. Did you see an area model? Like the hockey arena, or the rink, I should say? Did you see a set model with the hockey players, or even the pucks? Maybe you saw a linear model where you imagine the lines being the two ends and the halfway mark being the red dotted line in the center. This last component is where students are able to really explore partitioning that number line from 0 to 1 into equal parts and name those parts using fractions. Today, we've gone through some of those activities or stories or images that allow us to think about how those ideas develop from K to grade 3. You saw us move from visually comparing those fractions, all the way to thinking about on a number line from some of our resources in Mathologie. Mathologie or Mathologie consists of a series of little books from K to 3, activity kits, grade 1 and grade 2 available now, and grade 3 in the fall, and Mathology.ca. All grounded on our research, our learning progression, and some of the professional learning resources that you see here. All of those might be supported with your implementation specialists. Grade 3 is coming in August 2020, and it was classroom tested to really encourage student engagement in mathematics. It was classroom tested to address that diversity in math understanding within your classrooms and classrooms across Canada. It was designed to remove those time constraints that you find in planning effective, curriculum-focused, and developmentally appropriate math lessons. It was tested to address all those curriculum expectations effectively and efficiently. And of course, it was designed to encourage a growth mindset in mathematics. Here on the right-hand side, you see Mathology.ca that we featured here today with some of the activity kits and little books that you'll find available in .ca come the fall. We also have math mats to encourage student thinking in the bottom right-hand corner. It's flexible with Mathology.ca in the center. The activity kit and the little books will all be found on Mathology.ca, as well as the math mats that encourage risk-taking through a laminated card that students can use individually, all supported with those interactive tools on Mathology.ca. So register now for a free 2-week preview. Go to www.pearsonmathology.ca and get access to all the books and the cards you saw today, and many more. Of course, we value your feedback. We'll be doing 9 more webinars coming up, and the link we're going to put into the chat pod. We really value this feedback, and we use it to better develop some of our upcoming webinars. And I have a colleague that's just going to put it in the chat pod now. We'll give you just a moment to fill it out before we come right back. We'll be back in about 30 seconds. Please feel free to open up the survey. There are a few short questions that you can always address and answer after the webinar when we come back in about 10 seconds. All right, so I'm going to keep moving because it is in the chat pod, but of course, if you have a moment to do the feedback right after this, we really appreciate it. So buy now and save. Until July 15th, we have a series of different bundles for Mathology.ca and activity kits, and even Math Makes Sense top-up bundles. So please contact your local sales rep, and I'm going to put up all their contact info in just one moment. And here you are. As I wrap up, please feel free to ask any questions in the chat pod. I'll be here for another 15 minutes or so. Feel free to put any of your questions in there and I will address them. Thank you so much for joining me tonight and have a great evening.